Hello, coaches. I am overdue. This video series is overdue, I should say, and I've really wanted to be able to have this series looking at coaching structure. And when I say coaching structure, it can be anything from the agenda setting, setting up the agreement, the check-ins that might happen in the coaching session, and then also maybe how you wrap up the session in terms of a structured approach there. Um, it's one of those topics in coach training that is often pushed against because of some objections that we'll cover throughout the series. And yet it's also one of the most important aspects of coaching that makes it coaching. So an effective use of structure is very important for coaching so that the client is able to drive the session. And if the structure ever feels like it is driving the session, it is not the structure's fault, but the fault of the coach not bringing in the client language to make that structure more responsive and meaningful to the client. So we'll kind of unpack all of that through the series. And instead of starting with agenda setting, because I have a lot of content out there already on agenda setting, and we'll revisit that throughout the series, I did want to start with the check-in because it is one of the most important ways to help a coach recover their presence in a coaching session. And yet, oftentimes coaches feel like it's one of the more unnatural things in a session. It feels like it comes from the outside. The coach or the client was in a lot of flow. They were just going, and I wanted to just let them go. Oftentimes, coaches will say that and as the reason for not checking in. And yet, when the client is flowing, the check-in can be one of the best ways to help them continue to flow well. So we'll again kind of unpack that with not only this video, but all the videos in this series. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen, and we will begin by looking at the learning type of check-in. There's three major check-ins that we will unpack through this series, and we're going to start with learning checks. Again, this just is a very common experience, feeling like the ICF structure is unnatural and forced. And I will stress once again and continually throughout this experience, the ICF structure is a thing because it can be very meaningful and useful. And yet whenever structure is used without the integration of the other competencies, like maintaining presence and listens actively, for instance, then we will often feel like the structure is forced. It's a reflection of maybe a lack of integrating those other competencies. Here are the three major check-ins that I want to pose as part of the series: the learning check, the progress check, and the direction check. Let's go ahead and dive into the learning check. All of these will come together as we go. You'll notice that this blue bar, it's all kind of color coordinated. The blue bar is roughly within the first and second third of a session. And that's where I think a learning check can be most valuable. Maybe not immediately after the agenda is set, but somewhere between, after the agenda is set to getting about 2/3 of the way through a session. That's usually a best time to bring in a learning check. And the reason is it helps a client articulate where they are in the session, where they are with their thinking as it progresses through a session, how it relates to where they were at the beginning. So how they are now and where they are now, how that relates to the beginning. A learning check-in allows the client to create a synthesis statement or just some sort of mental synthesis. They are able to connect between their early and their current perspectives. They're able to verbalize how this perspective is related to that perspective. It naturally allows the client to articulate where they are with the agenda and what might come next. Now, I will say sometimes the client might just say, here's what I'm learning, and it may be important for the coach to say, from that perspective, where should we go next? But very often in my observation as a mentor, coach, and trainer, when a natural, useful learning check happens, the client will do a synthesis statement, like a summary, and then they'll often say, and that makes me think X. Like they will give like here's B, and where we are now, and A, where we were at the beginning, therefore C, like this is the new direction. So it's a nice way to do a check-in without it feeling like, where should we go next? Or how are we doing with the session? because those sound, yeah, a little bit more formulaic, and we'll look at how to make those more effective with the progress check, the direction check. The learning check-in can just sound like a natural question, though. It is the least intrusive of all of them, especially when we use the client language. Now, if I just say, what are you learning? That's honestly not a learning check. Now, the client might respond in that way, but it very often will just be a comment on the current language, the way they're communicating right now. They will very rarely say, this is what I'm learning about the current moment, and that is related to the agenda language in this way, and it helps me have this new thought. Usually they'll just give you a current state of their thinking in that moment. So what are you learning isn't exactly a learning check. That is also missing the client language. It's not going to be as effective. A learning check-in is going to be a connection of the agenda language and the present language. And maybe you connect the dots. Maybe this is like getting into the second, third. So you might have, how is the agenda language related to what you said a bit later and what you've said here? But most of the time it's just, how is what you're saying now related from before? So we'll look at some options here to explore a learning moment, a learning check-in. What are you learning about the agenda language is the most straightforward thing. What are you, and by the way, with all structure, with all coaching question list, if you just use the formula and that formula alone, like what makes this topic important to you, or what areas should we address as part of our agenda, and so on. Like if you just use that structure language, it's going to sound routine and mundane after the client has experienced it multiple times. So whenever we're doing a learning check, we don't necessarily want to always ask, what are you learning? We can do, what are you recognizing? What are you noticing? What's changed for you around the agenda language? So the client was talking about how they felt like a ship without a rudder or something like that. I always use that as a potential client language. So what are you learning about what your ship is really going to need? And that's a way for the client to reflect just instantly. If they started the agenda with like, I feel like that ship without a rudder. And the client or the coach has been leveraging that metaphor throughout the session. The coach says, so what are you learning about that ship without a rudder that you were talking about at the beginning? It helps the client synthesize. What are you recognizing? What are you noticing? What's shifted for you? All different ways of saying learning. Now, my preferred way of doing check-ins, though, is present language with agenda language. So how are these thoughts around the disconnect between you and your peers related to the ship without a rudder? How are your relationships with your peers and the ship metaphor from the beginning connected? Or what has changed about your perspective on the ship without a rudder now that you've recognized your peer relationships are really what's suffering most right now? Or what's the difference between your peer relationships and what you want for those? And what you had in mind when you said that you felt like a ship without a rudder. Now, some of these are contrasting and some are combinations, connections. The idea, though, is we just want to help the client reflect on how the present moment might be related to their agenda. The way I prefer to notate this, by the way, is like what are you learning between B and A? B being like the present moment, it's come now. A is the original part. How are part 2 of the session and part 1 of the session connected? How is B related to A? What have you learned about A now that you've come to B? What has changed about your perspective on A now that you've recognized B? What's the difference between B and A? All those kinds of questions, especially the ones that use the actual meaningful client language in the learning check, will help a client do a great synthesis, or hopefully they do. It often will prompt them to do a nice synthesis statement. And just on a note, or just to make this note real quick on synthesizing, coaches should be careful to do this for the client. When you're feeling the pressure of driving the session, because if you ask a lot of questions, eventually you're going to feel the weight of the session falling on your shoulders instead of the client's. Sometimes a coach might do a bit of a summary in those moments, and that will help reground the session. But it also means that you're doing the work of the summary too. So if we really want to help the client recenter the session on their behalf, help them do the synthesis. And we could just offer like, how would you summarize what you're taking away from the session so far? It's a bit formulaic, but it can get the job done. We could say, how would you summarize what you've learned from the agenda to now, using the language of the agenda to now? But the main thing is try to avoid providing that synthesis, doing that work for yourself. Otherwise, it's very possible that you might take more ownership of the direction. And we want to, through a learning check or any kind of check-in, help the client take more ownership. Hopefully, the main lesson from this video is that if you want to do these check-ins, the learning check might be the least intrusive. It can be really good within the first 2/3 of the session. And using the client language is what makes it come to life. If you ever feel like the structure is unnatural and forced, it might be because we're not using the client language, or the language we're using might not be that meaningful. So good agenda setting with client language, bringing in that language into a check-in, make it as natural as possible to make meaningful partnership come to life. Because throughout a session, the real structure that makes things work is the ongoing partnership. Partnership isn't driven by specific questions. It's driven by a bit of structure and a bit of open exploration, then a bit of structure and a bit of open exploration. Without the structure, the coach takes ownership of the session because of the assumptions that are behind their questions. But if the coach just uses the structure without meaningful language, then the structure takes ownership of the session and the client feels left without trust and safety. We want meaningful, trusting partnership by using client language in our check-ins. That's our start to the series on, coaching structure. And we will keep hitting these major themes of make it come to life by being responsive and using client language. So if anything, if you only watch this videos in the series, that's the main thing to consider as you experience coaching structure. If you ever feel like it's unnatural, reflect how much client language did I use? Was it meaningful language? And was this responsive to the session? Did I use my vocabulary? Did I use my words in a way that made it feel at home in the session based on what the client's needing? We will keep this going. Thank you for listening. Thank you for coaching, everybody.